I'm Kassie Sands, and you can see this up here, I'm the Director of Development and Administration at Support Kansas City. And Support Kansas City is a nonprofit here in town, and we offer back office, administration, accounting, development support for other nonprofits. So we work exclusively with other nonprofits. Our main focus is helping you work on your mission, and we are taking care of those things that we have the expertise for, and you may not have the budget to be able to hire full-time staff to manage those components of your job and your work. So that's kind of what we're here for. So my main role is managing the development team, and the projects that we work in most often are database projects. We work in donor database development, setting up people and moving them from existing systems into new systems, helping sort of clean up or fix systems that they're already in. We work with a range of softwares, and then we also do the actual development work, so helping create fund development plans, grant writing, annual appeal support, special event support. So we kind of have a range of services that we offer, but a big piece of what we do are the databases because it's such an important tool, and it can become such a mess so quickly. So we have some kind of, I have kind of a broad view of databases today. I didn't want to get too specific in one category or on one topic because I'm sure everybody's coming from kind of different places on it. So I'm not going to focus exclusively on volunteer databases, but everything I'm saying applies to volunteer databases as much as it would a program database or a donor database. And often for many small to mid-sized organizations, that's one system and you're trying to do all of it in one place. So we're really talking about the same thing. So please, this is casual and laid back, so if I am talking about something and you want more information, please ask me. Please stop me and I'll be happy to answer any questions, and then at the end we'll be able to, this won't take the full time, so at the end we can certainly talk in more detail. I'm not going to make software recommendations because that's really on a case-by-case basis, but I will talk about some of the softwares that we work with. So we've kind of already gone through this. Who is currently working in a database or sort of in charge of a database? What software are you guys in?
We use Razor's Edge.
Sure. Anybody else? Yeah.
Volunteer work.
Sure. It's a great one. That's why we're all here, right?
We use Access.
Okay, yeah, that works. As long as you're not telling me an Excel spreadsheet, because that is not really a database. That's an Excel spreadsheet. I had a client tell me, oh, we've got a great database. And I said, well, what is it? Well, it's like 15 spreadsheets. I was like, okay. Anybody else working in a database currently?
Yeah, Access.
Access. So this is just, I want to kind of give you a good solid overview of what are some of the best practices around databases. How do you know that your database is working well for you? And what are some of the things you can do to tweak it or improve it as you're sort of evaluating what your current system's doing? Hi, how are you?
Hi.
We were just getting started. Did you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name is Kylie Puck. I'm also with the Not for Grace Ministry.
Oh, great. You are well represented today.
Yeah.
Well, some main database options. Obviously, we list the ones that we work with most often, and we don't have a select database system that we work with consistently. We work with a range of them. Sometimes it depends on the client. If a client comes in and says, hey, we need some help in Razor's Edge, our staff needs to be able to work in that system. Many of them are very similar. One of the best ones is obviously Volunteer Mark, which is why we're here again, why it's on my list. We also work a lot in Salesforce. And Salesforce does some volunteer management. It's got a separate component, but it's not set up in the same way that Volunteer Mark is so that you can easily communicate with volunteers. It's more for the tracking purposes, and you would have it as a part of a donor database or a program database as well. So it's more of a broad system. It's free to nonprofits. If you apply for through their foundation, they'll give you 10 free licenses if you qualify. Most organizations qualify. If you're not a large healthcare facility or a large school, you can qualify and get the system. So it's free up front, but the setup and the customization is where it can get more expensive. But again, there's no monthly fee, and so that can be really affordable for a lot of people. We also work in Donor Perfect. It's a very nice system, works very well, lets you track in a lot of detail, strong reporting. It's also cloud-based. So most of the ones I'm talking about have a cloud-based version. So as long as you've got internet access, you can log in. You can be working from home. You can have multiple people logged into the system at the same time. It works really well. Blackbaud is kind of the grandfather of all databases. I think they own 15, 20 different software options. The top of the line is Razor's Edge, very expensive. It's fantastic. If you can afford it, it's a wonderful system. But the training is expensive, the ongoing fees are expensive, the support and technology piece of it is really expensive. So if it's in your budget, it's the best. Nobody will deny that it's the Cadillac of databases, but most people can't afford that. So I have it on there, ETAP, yeah.
Do you all do training for Razor's Edge and Beacon's Edge?
We don't. No, that's,
Proprietary.
yeah, it's proprietary. They want to charge you whatever the current fee is for training per person. So, and it's usually, I think they have one in town maybe every other year, or you can have somebody come here and train you and pay for having them come and train you.
We were only able to do it because of a grant. We
Yes.
switched from donor profit.
Yeah. And Razor's Edge is fantastic. I mean, Razor's Edge is fantastic. Again, like I said, if it's in your budget, I think it's well worth the money. As long as you can maintain the support you need and as long as you maintain training. So if you have staff turnover, that can be the big challenge. You can get a couple people trained, but the minute someone leaves, you're losing that person's experience and training, and it's hard to transfer that to somebody else in as much detail as their training goes into. So that's just one of the challenges of working in any database, I think, is the training piece. eTapestry is another Blackbaud product. I'm candid when I'm in meetings like this because I don't want people to get stuck with a system they don't like. We don't like eTapestry. I can't tell you how many, yeah, you've got it.
We did not.
Yeah, it's terrible. The reporting's terrible, it's awkward, it's clunky. It's not very expensive, but they charge you to just do basic exports of the data. It's your data. Why should anyone charge you to get your own data back out? Makes no sense to me. But that's where they make their money is if you want to get a big export of your own information, you have to pay them to do it. The reporting features are uncomfortable is the best I can describe them. You think you want something and you go in and you're like, okay, well, I just want to get donors who gave in August and they gave over $50 and they didn't give last year. Shouldn't be that complicated, right? There are so many filters and sort of attributes, and it's not a system that we recommend. I can't tell you how many times we've had people come to us in eTapestry and had us move them into something else. That's the most common system that people come to us and say, hey, we have eTapestry, can you fix this? Or can you get us out and move us into something better? So not my favorite, but it's on the list. Arrays is a newer one that we've worked with here pretty recently in the last 3 months. It's affordable. It's a combination donor database and accounting software. It's cloud-based, so everything is all sort of fits together. You can choose if you want both pieces, or you can just go with the donor database side. But it's got good reporting. It's got good coding. It lets you really filter out really nicely when you're trying to get information to connect with donors or to connect with volunteers. It doesn't have like a scheduling component. So if you had it, it would be something you'd certainly want Volunteer Mark still to be able to manage that piece of it. Yeah.
Question, do any of these play well with QuickBooks?
No database currently plays particularly well with QuickBooks in a, sharing data between the systems. QuickBooks is working on an app. With Salesforce, anything that's external from the actual main Salesforce, they call it an app, kind of like on your phone. And they're working on an app that would sync QuickBooks to Salesforce. But because these are two really large companies with very proprietary sort of software and design, they're never going to fit perfectly together. There's always going to be some human interaction that has to happen to make sure that you're not getting duplicates and that codes are the way that you want them and gifts are going where you want them. But Salesforce is probably getting the closest to syncing up more closely with QuickBooks. And the rest of them, you can find ways to make it work. You can do exports and you can kind of tease it to make it work, but it's not set up automatically to work that way. That's why I think Arrays is kind of a nice system. If you're looking for something that's all linked together, it's already that way. It's already preset, really nice people, easy to work with. So we like that one a lot. There are a lot more. I have an article that if you're interested, you can get my card and I'll email it to you. It's from the Nonprofit Times, came out at the end of last year, I think September, October. And it's great. It's got a whole description of different database options, what other kind of cutting edge nonprofits are doing with their database systems. And then my favorite part is the last page has like a list of all the top softwares in the country currently. And we probably worked with about half. And it's great. If you're looking to get a new system or you want to get more information about what you're in currently, I think it's really useful. So if you want it, just let me know and I'll be happy to send it out. Questions on software before I move on to next topic? Okay. So how do you choose or improve your current system? Those are sort of two different things, but if it's not in your budget to switch systems, or you like the basic structure of your system, but you're kind of frustrated maybe with the accuracy of the data, or you've got multiple lists and you're not really sure how to get those all in together, we do sort of a flow chart to show what are all the ways the information is coming to you. Maybe your website, maybe your PayPal account, maybe from events, maybe from volunteers, multiple shifts of volunteers at different locations. Maybe you got a mailing list from a friend who's got a bunch of people that she would like to include. So you have all these sources of data that are coming in, and you really have to say up front, how are we going to code and filter those so we can track who are these people, what's our primary relationship with them, how do we want to utilize either their time, or if we're going to seek them out as donors, how do we utilize them as make them into friends, and how do we find ways to connect with them? So finding ways to really code that information. The big piece in any system is going to be tracking demographic information. So obviously that's huge. Having clean, tidy data that's consistent. So if you always use abbreviations for states, make sure all of your records do that. If you have phone numbers and email, make sure those are all formatted accurately. So when you pull them out, you're not getting these errors because there's no @ symbol in your email address, or it says @gmail and it doesn't have the .com. Basic stuff like that's going to trip you up when it's time to pull a list and send out an email. You're not going to be able to just pull it out and send it. You're going to have to stop, clean it up, format it correctly, and then send it every time. But if you keep it clean at the beginning, it makes a big difference. So demographic information is huge. Being able to schedule, I think that's, if you're volunteer coordinators, that's a big piece. Having sort of a shift structure that you have in place, being consistent with that, I think is a big help. So scheduling, a lot of these systems have some kind of scheduling. I think Volunteer Marks is the most robust and the easiest to use of all of those other systems. Volunteer Mark can't serve in all of the ways that some of these other systems can, but it does a fantastic job around the scheduling piece and around keeping track of demographic information. And then the filtering piece, so like I said, you really need codes and sort of some structure around who are all these names. Otherwise, it's just this big list of names, and you don't know where they came from, you don't know what their relationships are amongst each other, you don't know who knows who, if it's a list from a board member or a volunteer. You need to find some way to tag those folks or mark those folks through coding or grouping or some feature depending on your database to say, okay, these are all from Barb. Barb sent all these names over. She thinks they all might be potential volunteers. How do we group those folks together so we can go back later and say, oh, 5 of Barb's people showed up, it was great. Or 5 of Barb's people sent a gift in. They couldn't volunteer, but they sent a donation. So you can communicate back to them, and you can also communicate to Barb and thank her for that kind of support. So it's really being able to filter and track who's coming into the system, what's their role with you, and what's their relationship so that you can further advance that relationship. How do you get them more connected to you? Good communication is the best way to do that. Keeping them connected to what your mission is and what your successes have been, and being able to send an email or send a paper letter is the easiest way to do that, or make a phone call. Reporting. I think reporting covers a couple of different categories to me. There's the kind of reporting that you're going to send to your board, right? There's the certain financial reports or donor data or volunteer numbers that you need to share with your board. There are the kinds of reports that you may, if you've got a grant and you've been required to track a certain amount of data through that grant, being able to track that in a database is a huge bonus, being able to pull those reports easily. And if you know what those grant requirements are up front, it's really easy to set that up as soon as you get the grant so that you're tracking the information consistently in the system. And then I had already talked about communicating a little bit. One of the ways that I think people get stuck is they get this new database, and they've had all these spreadsheets, and they put all the spreadsheets in, but maybe their method of communication is normally email, but they've not done a great job of collecting email addresses. So you think, hey, let's get rid of our paper newsletter and just start sending an e-newsletter. And you go and you pull a list and you go, well, crud, we've got 1,000 names, but we only have 200 email addresses. So it's not really going to work to get rid of your paper newsletter. You're really going to need to continue and find a way to collect those email addresses. So making sure that you're collecting that data whenever you're interacting with people, finding good ways to collect that information and track it so that you've got it when you're ready to kind of make those transitions or add more social media or add more communicating through email. I think that's really important. I know Volunteer Mark requires an email address, so that's a big help. You're at least getting it for volunteers who've gone through that system, so that's great. So I said at the beginning, databases are wonderful except when they're not, and it's usually when no one's in charge, right? So who's in charge of the database is a huge issue that kind of needs to be established at the beginning. So there needs to be one key person, and we usually call that the system admin, and that person should be all-powerful when it comes to the database, meaning I can tell you if you've made a mistake, even if you're the executive director, and I have to find a polite way to do that, but I still need to be able to communicate, hey, that's not how we're going to enter information because of these reasons. So I think it's really important who's going to be in charge of your system. That needs to be decided up front. I know it changes. I know it's not often a concrete thing. It can be a little fluid. But I think that's important that there's a system admin who's really going to be the enforcer in making sure that you stick to the rules that you've set. Yeah.
Do you have any estimation if you're adding this duty onto someone who already has a very full plate?
Sure.
How much time per month, per week for setting up a new database?
Sure. Setting up a new database can take between 20 and 40 hours to set up a brand new system. If you have an existing system and you're adding just a role as a system admin to sort of monitor it and keep it clean, it depends on how much activity you have in that system. So if you get new names and new donors every week, if you have multiple people in the system, then that's going to increase the amount of time. If you get a couple donations a week and there's only a couple people in the system, it's probably only a couple hours a week. But if you've got a lot of activity, if you have a lot of volunteers who have access to it, which is kind of my nightmare, and every time I hear that there's like 20 people in a database, just because you don't know what they're doing. You don't know that they've been trained well. You don't know that they're respecting the way that you'd like the data entered in the first place. But I think it depends on the amount of activity that you have.
Sure, that's true.
Yeah. And it's a good thing to sort of take a week and try it and track your time. We have to track our time really closely because we bill clients for our time. And so we can track it and tell you within a couple of weeks how much time something's taking. And I think that can be really useful in your job. You may in your head think it's going to take a lot more time or a lot less time, and I think actually writing it down can help a lot. And it also helps if you have to go and then explain why it's taking so long or why you're so busy, when you can clarify, these are the things I'm doing and this is why it's taking the amount of time it's taking. So is anybody currently sort of the system admin for their database? Are you currently in that position?
Yeah.
No.
Our HR director and our director of development.
Gotcha. So are they
Are
in
they
it?
overall, because we have it for everything. So we have
everybody.
The event module and volunteer module.
Gotcha.
and everything. So
Gotcha. That makes
I only
sense.
handle the volunteer module, but overall they do it.
Sure. Do they monitor it pretty closely? And that's good. That's good. Anybody else?
I'm going to be
Are you?
one of the two people in charge.
That's coming up on your plate.
Coming up.
Anybody else currently sort of managing a database? You are too. Do you get full control? Do they let you sort of
Yes.
tell people? Good.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Good. Do you see a lot of issues in your system, or do you think? Yep.
Yeah.
Do you have a lot of people in it?
Yeah. we
Yeah.
do. That's
Yeah.
part of the problem.
Yeah. That can be a big challenge, I think. So the other piece that comes with being a system admin, one is monitoring the data and making sure things are being entered correctly, and making sure if you've got gifts or if you've got shift hours that you're tracking, making sure that that's all being entered. But you're also going to end up being the person that people come to with questions. So if something isn't working right, or they tried something and they're not able to get the result they want, you're going to end up being the person they come to with questions. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just starting, we're just putting together a database, and I was wondering, is there a template or a system that you would recommend?
Sure. I'll give you this. I'll give you a copy of this article. In fact, you can just take my copy. This is an article from the Nonprofit Times, and it's a great article. But then the very last page lists all the top softwares, and those will often be a combination of donor databases and volunteer databases. So if you want just volunteer, make sure you look on that list and sort of see which ones have a volunteer component specifically. There's a range of pricing too. So you end up being the person that everybody comes to with questions. So you have to sort of have a plan in place for how do we answer those questions? What are our sort of conventions and rules as an organization around how we track data? And somebody has to write sort of a user's guide, user's manual, procedures manual. I think that that's a huge piece in working in databases is having a user's guide. So we talked about having clean and tidy data, so data that's consistent, data that matches consistently so that states are all listed the same. Another big thing, and this is such a nerdy thing, like I call myself a database nerd because I just know how important it is when you're trying to send mailings, when you're trying to send out special event invitations, when you're trying to solicit major donors and sponsors, you really want to address them correctly. I can't tell you how often I've gotten mail that has my name wrong, or it's got my husband's name and I'm listed as like Mrs. Joseph Sands. Well, my name's not Joseph. I mean, everybody has kind of ways that they prefer to be addressed. Some are more traditional, and it may be a Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Sands. Some maybe just prefer first names. There are a lot of alternative ways that people prefer to be addressed, a lot of hyphen names, same-sex married couples. There's a range of ways that you have to be concerned about how you address people. And so up front, deciding as an organization, how are we going to communicate with people? Are we going to be a first name basis organization? Are we going to use titles? How are you going to do that? And making sure all of the records in the system are set up in a way that is conducive to that. So once you decide, being consistent with it across the board.
Do you have any recommendations using Mr., Ms., Mrs., or just first name basis? Do you have any recommendations which way to go on that?
I think it depends on your organization's culture and the culture of your donors and volunteers. So in your case, I know at Shepherd Center,
Mr., Mrs.
I would use titles.
Yeah.
I have a client who the entire board is 75 or over. And so when we do mailings, they're horrified if I send first names only. They're very upset about that. It's a big piece of their culture that everybody's addressed with respect to them. That's addressing people with respect. So we know in their database, we always have titles. If we can tell what your gender is, we're going to put a title in. If we're not sure, we may have to leave it that way and work on getting that information. But if I've got a Chris and I'm not really sure if that's a man or a woman, those are the only times we don't put that in there. So I think it depends on the culture of your organization. Obviously, senior citizens prefer, in most cases, to be addressed with more formal titles. I have a kids organization. They always use first names. They don't care about titles. They don't use titles. We will occasionally modify a record because maybe a grandparent makes a gift and the grandparent wants a title, and they may be very specific. You have some people who are very specific about how they want to be addressed, and they're happy to tell you that. And so it's your job to make sure you put that in the system and that there's a note so that that doesn't get changed if you go back and do some cleanup around how you're addressing people. So clean, useful data. When I say useful data, do you have a bunch of names in there that you haven't heard from these people in 5 or 10 years and it's just cluttering up your system, and you go to pull a list and you're like, God, we don't have 5,000 donors. We don't have 5,000 people that we really want to communicate with. How do you narrow down and decide to get rid of some of those names so you can get to the people that you really need to work with and really want to connect with, or really are connected volunteers who come in consistently? You know, a lot of times you may get lists of people who volunteered in a big group and they never come back to volunteer. How long should they stay in your system? Those are some of the decisions that you should set up in advance and say, okay, every 3 years we're going to do a mailing, or every 3 years we're going to invite these people to come volunteer. And if we don't hear from them within 6 months after that mailing, we're going to archive their records. So if they come back, great, you can add them back in new. Doesn't hurt anybody, but it keeps your system clean and manageable and at a decent size so you can get information in and out and you communicate with people who really want to hear from you. So I think that's an important one, especially over time as your system gets bigger and bigger and you have all these names, and sometimes it's hard to track who do you know and is that really a valuable name for you. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas about how long to keep donor contact names?
Do you have donor history from them? I think that's hard because if you have donor history, in some ways your database is sort of the location that you're saving that historical information. And so we really don't delete records very often at all. We just will archive it or we'll find a way to code it so we don't pull it out when we're doing reports. If there's money attached, I never delete a record because that's sort of a document that or a system you're using to track. Even if you have an accounting software, that's still a system that sometimes auditors will have you pull a report from your database too to compare to your accounting side, and so you don't want to lose that history. I think if it's really, really old, like
67.
that might be okay. That might be okay. I was going to say the 90s. I was going to say like 99. So you're probably good. Your audit's probably done. You're probably fine.
Case this week.
Yeah. I think that's a good call because if you've not had any activity or talked to that person in years, why are they in there?
You mentioned like what to do every 3 years, but what about right up front? You know, if you got a great big old database that you're getting rid of, is there any way to figure out filtering or how to get rid of some of those names if you think
Does
they're not?
someone know them in your organization? That's what happens when you're first creating a database is you've got all these lists and God knows where the names all came from. And I don't mean this in a derogatory way. You just names somehow get collected sometimes and you're not really sure. Maybe the person before you had this list or it was 3 people ago and you've got all these names and there's no way to say who they are or why they're in there. So if you can't code them up front, is there a way to send out an email or send out a mailing to kind of let them know that you'd like them to come back or come to an event or volunteer? And you can put a generic code on them. Exactly, and if you send that out, most systems there's a way to track the mailings that you've sent. And so if you don't get a response from those mailings, those are the people that you can then archive. And finding a way to just be consistent. I think the big piece with databases is being consistent. So if you're going to have a procedure or a process, you need to stick with it. Because if you say it's going to be once a year or every 3 years we're going to do this, the minute you miss that and put it off because you've got 150 other things to do, it's going to be 6 years. And then it's going to be 8 years. And then you're going to have one of those systems where you can't find anything that you really want because there's just all this stuff in there. And we see those all the time. People come and they're like, our system's terrible and we don't know why. And you're like, well, when was the last time you had any kind of purge? What do you mean? And you're like, I get that you see these names as gold because potentially they could be donors, but they're not. At that stage, they're really not because they've not given you anything, time or attention or money at any point in the last 10 years. It might be time to retire those or at least get them out of the way so that they're not cluttering up the people who actually are interested in you and what you're doing and may be interested more if you could find a way to communicate with them more consistently. So consistent coding where you're sitting down and saying, okay, these are the events we're planning to have this year. Let's make sure that we've got codes in the system to track who are we inviting, when they say they're going to come or not, how do we track that? And if they make a donation or they come to the event and buy a ticket and an auction item, how are we tracking that? And saying at the beginning of the year, here are the codes for the events for this year. It doesn't mean they can't change. It doesn't mean that they can't, you can't add to them if you're going to have other events. But having those codes around special event activity, I think is really important, and setting that up in advance so everybody who's going to get in the system understands that this is how we're going to code those donations or those activities. So there's multiple layers of coding in a system. There's the people records, so there's my name and your name, and who am I to you as an organization. Maybe I'm a volunteer, maybe I'm a donor, maybe I'm a business sponsor. There's those levels of coding. There's the level, especially on the volunteer side, what kind of skills do they have? What kind of availability do they have? What kind of activities do they prefer to do? Maybe some people would rather stuff envelopes and some people would rather be hands-on with teen moms. Whatever that is, how do you track that and make sure that you've got places to record that? So I think that's important. And then having, like I said, those standard conventions so that you really, by the time, if you're starting a new database, by the time you're ready to go live with it and have everybody in it, you really need to have 2 things, sort of a standard conventions sheet that says this is how we address people, this is what our mailing addresses should look like, this is how we are going to track this, these types of information. So there's that sheet that's very basic, and then you need a more in-depth user's manual that says of all the activities we're going to do in the system, here's how you do that. Because it's really important to make sure that people are trained. So if you have 10 people in your database, of those 10 people, how many people are really trained? Most of the time, it's like 2 people have been trained and everybody else just watched those 2 people do stuff. And so now they just do it that way. It may not be accurate. It may not be exactly what you want. It may not be sort of those best practices and the best sort of database hygiene kind of habits. And so breaking those habits isn't that difficult if your organization is ready for it. That's a big one. Are people ready for it and willing to give some time? Because it's going to take a little bit of time to make those changes. And then is there a person in charge, that system admin, who's going to go in and help create those documents? And oftentimes it's multiple people who have to create them together. So you're going to have procedures, and your development director is going to have procedures, and there may be different people sharing a system, and you're each going to sort of need to carve out what's your role in that system, and what are the procedures that are going to go with that role. Questions around that? Did I beat the training horse hard enough? Training. The other, and these get a little technical, and these aren't particularly exciting or fun, and your tech team, whoever your tech support is, may actually do these for you. Depending on your database system, having user profiles. So let's say, and this isn't my executive director, but let's say some executive directors aren't very good in databases, but they need to be able to see the data. So they're worried about deleting stuff, or they're worried about making a mistake. So they can't do anything except read what's in the system, which is great. A lot of executive directors, that's all they want. They want to see donations, they want to see, look up a friend, look up a board member. They just want to have access. So having different levels for different users is really important. So if you can do that in your system, I think it's great. Volunteers, you can often categorize sections that they have access to, and then they don't have access to the rest of the system. So user profiles I think are vital. Strong passwords, cloud softwares like VolunteerMark, Salesforce, anything that's cloud-based, you need a strong password. It should not be 1234. It should not be password. It should not be, 2014 or donor123. It needs to be a complicated password. There are lots of apps out there on your computer that will track all your passwords, and so you don't have to remember them. You change them, the system on your computer will save it for you, and you don't have to worry about it. So you need complex passwords. It's a big issue because you've got all this data out there. You don't want people to be able to have access to it. And you need to change your passwords more than every 5 years. Really needs to be at least every 6 months. Once a year if you're really worried about maybe a lot of people have access and you don't want to make everybody change their passwords frequently. But you really need to have strong passwords that you change frequently enough. And then I'm going to beat this dead horse like I did the training. Backup, backup, backup. Does your system get backed up? Does your system get backed up? I would assume so. Backup, backup, backup. If you think that you are going to make a lot of changes, if you're going to go in and work in the system, if you're going to do maybe imports of big lists into the system, back it up first. Almost every single system will let you do an export of all of your data before you go in and do a lot of work to it. So we either back up daily or weekly depending on the database. So if there's not a lot of activity every day, weekly is fine. But daily, if you have a lot of activity, you really should be backing up every day. I've had a couple of terrible cases where somebody was putting a bunch of new lists of names into the system and they accidentally deleted a lot of records instead of putting the names in. And they didn't back up, and so they lost 2,500 names and had to find ways to recreate it. And so it's the worst feeling in the world when that happens. And it's really preventable. If you did a backup, it usually takes 5-10 minutes. All the data's right there for you. Problem solved. So literally somebody crying on the phone about a database. I'm like, are we really crying about it? We are, because it's 2,500 names. It's a big deal. She thought she was going to get fired. So backup, 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 backup. And then my last one on this slide is, do you have a disaster plan? I know that sounds kind of dramatic, like a tornado is coming through today, and what are you going to do? If you're on the cloud, if you've got one of these systems that's on the cloud, you're fine. It's there.
It happened at Westport Cooperative. They burned down and lost tons.
Yeah, when that church burned down, it was terrible. So what's your backup plan? What's your disaster plan if something happens? Do you take your backups off-site? Does someone take those off-site? We have a backup tape at our office. Somebody takes it off-site every night. There are lots of cloud backups where you can back up your whole system to, some server somewhere. Those are good options. But you really should talk about it now before there's a disaster. And you're like, well, crap. What are we going to do? The building burned down. We're stuck. It makes those 2,500 names lost and the other things seem like a really minor issue. But even things like your user's manual, if that's just a paper copy that sits in the office and you have a fire, where is that? If that was just on your server, just in your office, where does all that go? You have to start from scratch. So really making sure you've got a plan in place to do that. These are kind of just technical other things that we do for most of the systems that we manage. Monthly, we'll get in, and there are it depends on your system, but there are lots of ways to run duplicate checker. So it'll go through and match on name or address or some combination of those two. And then you can merge records so you don't have a lot of duplicate names in those systems. Because it's easy. If I spell my name slightly differently one week, and then a volunteer comes around and doesn't realize my real name's Catherine and they put it in as Cassie, she doesn't realize that I'm already in the system. So there's lots of ways that happens. So deduping once a month, I think, is a big help. We also do data spot checking. So if we have, let's say, a new person that we just trained, I'll go run reports after they've been in the system about a week, and I'll just look at the records that they've done and the names they've added, and I'll just make sure that they got it, that the training made sense, that they're not making any consistent errors or mistakes. And then if they didn't, it's a great time to just redirect and say, hey, we just went through that training. We were just checking the data to see how you're doing, and it looks like we may need to talk a little bit more about these areas. And it's not a criticism, it's just making sure that they understand and that they're feeling comfortable with the information that they're entering and with sort of those procedures. So we check that once a month for new users. And then, like I said earlier, the fewer users, the better. The more people that get in there, the messier it can be, unless you have a really structured system for how you enter information and you have a really tough system admin who's very pleasant but very happy to say, hey, this isn't working, or this information isn't being tracked the way we need it to be tracked. And that usually falls on us when we're in systems helping other clients. We have to go, I think your new staff might need a little more training, because that's not exactly what you want when you're running a mailing list to invite 2,000 people to an event. You've lost all your titles, or she's entering people 3 or 4 times, so you're going to end up getting this mailing list that's got tons of duplicates. And people hate that. I hate to get 3 invitations to one event at my house, right? One to me, one to my husband, and one to some name that we don't recognize. Yeah. Some combination, right? It happens all the time. And you think, what a waste of postage and printing costs, and you don't want your donors to think that when they get mail from you. A couple other just little reminders or little things you may want to do. Looking at your codes consistently and making sure that they're still working for you. If you've been in a system for a few years, do your classifications around people work? Are you tracking your events the way that makes sense? Has it gotten so full in there it might be time to delete old codes and make sure you just have new current codes? Do you send your mailing list off to the national change of address? You can send it off, the post office will send it off for you, or your print house will send it off for you. They'll send it back to you with all the changes of address. We recommend doing that at least once a year. The price varies. I think it depends on the number of records that you have. But it's reasonable, and it makes more sense than paying first class for mail, for a big bulk mailing, paying first class, and then having all of those come back to you piecemeal. This is one spreadsheet list, so it's really helpful. Sensitive data. I have a client who really likes to track Social Security numbers. That's kind of private information. I'm hesitant that they do that because it's private and there's a lot of identity theft issues, and there are a lot of concerns about having that kind of information accessible to other people. So that's a question I have for you. Do you have sensitive information that you should or shouldn't be tracking? Do you have to track it? If you do have to track it, do you have it controlled in a way that not everyone can get access to it, who doesn't really need it to do their job? So that's something I think you have to ask internally. Are we tracking things that, one, really need to be tracked, or is it just information we think is kind of helpful to have? Or if it's really vital, are you making sure that people's privacy is being respected and that you've got good controls around how you track that data? And then I said this, back up, back up, back up. Not kidding, please back up, please back up. So that's it. Questions? Experiences you want to share, or softwares that you're using currently that you really like? I mean, now's the time to sort of hear what works and what doesn't, and I'm happy to answer any questions you've got.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. You're all database nerds now. What software are you guys going to work in at Shepherd Center?
Well, we're going to try to do an access database. We're going to be using volunteer mark for some of our scheduling and stuff. But
Sure.
for demographic and donor, our problem is the QuickBooks issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's where our donor information is. So
Sure.
what we're looking at right now is volunteer mark for scheduling, demographic database for mailings and what have you, and then our separate database and Quicken for our separate
QuickBooks
information.
for
So
that. Yeah.
it'd be nice if we could do it all together. We don't know yet how
Yeah.
much we're
Is
gonna
access for your donors too, or you have another piece for that?
That's what we're trying to figure out. We've got, right now, all the donor information's going into QuickBooks, and it seems a shame to have to do double work.
Yeah.
We'd
And
love
QuickBooks
to
is a
have-
terrible database.
We don't like QuickBooks.
Oh, QuickBooks doesn't work well at all for like actual communications or tracking people. You just can't get the kind of reporting.
But whether we'd have the expertise to actually set up
Sure.
a donor database like that,
Sure.
I don't know. Now, we had eTapestry, and not only was it a terrible database, they didn't keep it up. So
Yeah.
it's supposed to keep track of donor info, but it's so
Yeah.
outdated,
No,
it's
it's
not
terrible.
even worthwhile.
Yeah.
So if we were gonna start fresh, I mean, I think we could keep simple donor database
Oh, sure.
in our access.
Sure.
You know, and still keep the QuickBooks separate. So
Sure.
I think that's probably what we're gonna end up doing.
We usually recommend, because we do, since a huge piece of our business is accounting. I mean, we have
Mhm.
15 staff, and there's only 3 staff on my team. That tells you how large everybody else is accounting. And so we really say, as far as QuickBooks goes, it's just not set and created to track donors in the same way. And so we often recommend that if you can get out of it and move all of that data, because you can export it all into spreadsheets, if you can move it into a better system, if it's Access, if it's Donor Perfect, if it's Salesforce, then you can go back to just putting the summary information in QuickBooks, and the bookkeeping piece is a lot faster when you don't have to track every single donor name and all of the detail, because the detail is all going to be in your your database software, and you can easily pull reports out that will pull by deposit date, and you can track how much was in each category, and it makes the accounting team really happy because they've got a clean report, and it's not going to take them 2 hours to enter all the addresses and names and all that into QuickBooks when it's just not. You can't get a mailing list easily. You just can't do the things that you can do in any of the other systems we've talked about.
That would be my preference.
Yeah.
It sounds like.
Yeah.
I have a quick question on the dedupe.
Mhm.
Is there any? And we may have talked about this a little bit when you were over, Andrew. Is there any way for it to recognize, like, other, instead of a unique field and all that? But is there any way for it to kind of recognize? Hey, you've entered a similar name and address before.
It depends on the system you're in. Some of the systems will absolutely do that. It really depends on the system. And Access, I don't know. Access isn't one that I'm as familiar with.
I know you set up, like, if you have an idea, you can't have 2 identical addresses,
Right.
for instance.
Right.
But a lot of times you want identical addresses
Right.
because it's husband and wife.
Absolutely.
So, but maybe just a warning flag or something.
I think
'Cause that's one of our issues.
I'm sure there's ways to do that. I know most of the other systems, you'll get a pop-up that will say, are you sure you want to add a new record? This record matches based on these categories. So Donor Perfect does that, at least, and Salesforce does. You need to buy a separate app that will do that piece for you, but it does do that. And if you want my card, I'm happy to pass cards out, and feel free to give me a call if you've got questions.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I know our accounting person works with you.
Yeah.
Tearing her hair out.
Anybody else?
Do you have any tips for encouraging other staff members to get on board the nerd train?
It's hard sometimes, isn't it? I know. It's hard sometimes. It's hard to get people excited because I think I think most people hate change of any sort. I mean, I know I do sometimes. I think it can be challenging. So I think making sure that you're talking to them about what their needs are. When we're meeting with new clients, we talk to all the staff people who are going to be in the system, and we talk about what are your needs? What are the things you want to be able to track so that you can make sure the system is meeting their needs, and you're talking to them from what is a priority to them. And I think that's a big piece of it. And that training and that conversation is what usually helps for most organizations. Sometimes it's a cultural issue, and sometimes the culture of the office is not to share information. I've worked with offices where everybody has their own spreadsheet, and they don't want to share it. They don't want to put it into one big group because they're worried about it, or they're worried somebody's going to get in and mess it up. And that's a harder one. That usually has to be somebody from the top down saying, hey, you have to do this. This is what we're doing. But I think talking to people about what their needs are in the system and how can you adjust the system to kind of meet their needs, even if it's small things. Or talking to them about, sometimes people don't know what the system can do, or if they're just not comfortable with technology. Sometimes that's a big barrier. So giving them a little tour and talking to them about what it can do and showing them what it does for you. I usually convince people by talking about things that work for me on the fund development side. So if I'm doing grant writing or those sorts of things, what can Salesforce do to help me do that? I track grants in it. I can pull a list of volunteers who came on a certain day. There's lots of that, and that's usually what works for people, is showing them what the results are.
I have a question, but I'm not sure how to phrase it. One of the biggest problems we have are people's roles changing. For instance, several of our programs that have little community advisory boards, and people go on and off these boards. Do you recommend, what's the best method to try to get your staff members to keep you, if
Tell you
the
what's
database
going
is
on.
going to be worthwhile, they need to keep that information flowing to you. But I mean, I think of a corporate form, that you have to fill out every time there's a change, but
I think you have to regiment it so that and that's why I say the system admin, there has to be a person who is going to follow up and make sure people give them that. Because you often cannot trust, and I don't mean this in a negative way, you just can't trust them to make that a priority because they're working on other stuff and they don't view it with the same sort of priority and value that you may.
things happen so fast.
Yeah, and people are busy. Everyone's busy. Everybody's got 20 different roles that they're trying to fill. So I think if you regiment it and have your very friendly, polite email that goes out every 2 weeks or once a month that says, hey, can you just inform me, what are any updates? If you had staff changes, any good information that you think I need to know to keep the system updated.
Changes.
Yeah, because we have to do that on our end. I have to email clients, and we email about every 6 months, and we say, any board changes, any grouping changes that your system currently has that we need to make updates to. Because if they call me the next week and say, I need a board list, and you pull it and it's wrong, they don't trust it, and they wonder, well, why is it wrong? Well, no one ever sent you a list to update it, so of course it's wrong.
So that's a good idea. Email every 2 weeks. Say,
Yeah.
okay, give us
And just
some
put it on
changes.
your Outlook calendar or whatever calendar you use and just send it out when you get in, and use the same, don't redo yourself, just do the same text you did last time. I copy emails all the time.
I think you can just set it up to go
Yeah,
automatically.
just do it automatically.
I'm so lazy.
No, that's not lazy. That's what I mean when you say if it's a process and you can regiment it and you don't have to think about it. I think that's the best. Anybody else? Did we overwhelm you with database nerd talk?
We went from because we had donor perfect for our donor database, but we didn't buy the volunteer module of donor perfect. So we had an access database, which doesn't merge to Razor's Edge. So
Imagine that.
yeah. And then I just started in October with this position. So I'm still trying to find and organize all of the, like we have the access, and then I have hard copy files, and then I have Outlook contact lists, and
Do you have an intern? You need an intern.
I do need an intern. So, I use summer sabbatical people, but
Oh, there you go.
but I'm still trying to figure out like if everybody if one person is in like all of the spots, or this person's in an Outlook contact, she doesn't have a file, but she's not on Razor's Edge either. So then I don't know do you have any
We work
advice
with
on how to
yeah.
best.
We work with multiple lists all the time. So if we're doing a conversion and let's say you come to us with 15 lists and then you need to dedupe that against your existing system. So it's harder with Razor's Edge because I don't know what your control is around doing imports in with new data. So it depends on the system for that part of it. But the deduping part is pretty consistent. So we usually try to make sure, and this goes back to the clean data stuff, we try to make sure whatever your spreadsheets are that you're working from, if it's Access, you're going to have to pull it out into just a basic Excel as much as you can. You may have tables that you have to merge a little bit. But we will put a code on each spreadsheet. So it'll be our source code to identify where the information came from. And then once we make sure the data is all clean and all the columns match, that's the big piece. Do you have all the same columns? Sometimes you'll have the name column and it's first and spouse and last. And then the other spreadsheet has first column, spouse name, last name, and so you need to find a way to make sure those are all consistent. And then you put them all into one big pot of one huge Excel spreadsheet. Keep all the originals. You put them all into one big spreadsheet, and that's where your deduping starts. The system can do some of it for you, but you're really going to have to do some of it just by hand because you don't want to lose that source code, I'm guessing, if you need to know where it came from.
Because that's what I guess I'm pretty much kind of doing it by hand slowly
Sure.
as I can. But then I'm like, what do I do now? Like,
You need to know what your end game is. So are you going to be able to take all of those lists and put them into one, And then is someone at your office or someone on your tech support or Razor's Edge, are they going to be able to take that list and put that into Razor's Edge for you? That's the big gap for me. Or are you going to do a different set? I mean, you don't want a separate database. You want it all in Razor's Edge.
Oh, it's going, yeah, it's all.
So who's going to do that for you? That would be my main question for you. And can they give you guidelines around what does that sheet need to look like?
Yeah, that would be either HR director.
Yeah, so I would ask and say, how are we going to do that? Because we always reverse engineer. So we know what the fields are going to be. We know where we want the information to end up. So we go backwards and say, how do we get all of this to fit over here? But I need to know how that process is really going to work. So what do they need from you in order to get all that information in? Because it's their responsibility at that point to dedupe it in Razor's Edge. Because you can't as easily as they can.
Yeah, because we just don't know if everybody from our really old access is in Razor's Edge, and we know if it was just better to start fresh.
I'd move names in. You often, and I think Razor's Edge has deduping inside of it. So there may be ways you can put all your names in and then dedupe it from inside of Razor. You'll dedupe your big list, like all your small lists, when you move it over. But once you get it into Razor's Edge, it can help you dedupe what records are already in there and what are the new ones. That's my recommendation based on not having worked with Razor's Edge in like 3 years. So keep that in mind. But the end game is always the same. What does it need to look like, and how do you get the fields to match?
Full of questions. Gave you Tom right in the middle of this. You mentioned events. Okay, roles and events. Are those two different things, or so a role would be like they're a volunteer, they're a
Yes.
board member, they're this. Events would be they participated in this
Yes.
program, the gala, the
Yes.
okay.
Because you're going
So
to
that's
probably
two
have
different
one role.
fields.
So it's the people codes versus like event activity codes. So most systems have different ways that you're going to be able to track, because you only want one record from me. You only want my main demographic record. But I'm going to have multiple activity records or event records. And so you need different codes
You can have
for
multiple-
that structure.
Multiple roles over here, multiple activities over here.
Exactly. So there's different ways, depending on what system you're going to be in, to set those up and have those in place so you can track them. But most people are going to have multiple. Let's say I'm in a database. You're going to have 3 event mailings that you sent to me. Maybe I came to 1. And then maybe I volunteer and I have all these shifts that I volunteered with you, and I have this set of skills that you want to be able to track and my availability. So you're going to really need to be able to segment those into different categories. Same with donations. That's a whole separate one.
I need to ask a really basic question.
Please.
What does coding mean, and how do you go about doing that?
So coding, I always start with, let's talk about just the people in your database, right? So let's say you have a list of 100 people. What's sort of the main relationship or main type of person that they are? Is it a business? Is it a service organization? Is it an individual? Who are they? And so that's the very basic level. So you could go pull a list of all the churches. Maybe you work with churches a lot. And so you want to categorize those as churches so you can get those records out and just pull out the churches. Or you just want to pull out volunteers. So maybe that's a code. So when I say coding, I just mean what's sort of the structure of how you're going to get that information back out, or how you're going to be able to communicate with certain groups and pockets of people.
So, in my layman's terms, it would be your list of people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like because we have a million spreadsheets.
Sure.
And so, if we're trying to compile all this information into one database, we put them in there as churches. So that's one way that they're coded. But they may be coded because they're a donor as well.
Right.
Kind of thing. So they have more than one list that they're in.
Sure.
Okay. Is that?
Yep, you got it. And you'll have separate codes around your donations. So you're going to have people or business records, which is going to, because most systems there's a main demographic record. And then all the things that are mine, either events I've come to or money I've given, are going to be separate sort of tables that are attached to my record, right? So if you look me up, you can see my name, and then you can see how many gifts I've given. So those gifts also need to be coded in a way that lets you report on them accurately, or lets you send the right thank you letter, or it lets you match up to your accounting software. So if you've got a certain account code that you use for special events, you would want to set that up so that your database matches your accounting chart of accounts. So we would at least have a fund code or an account code or whatever you call it, and have those match. And you can put the numbers in. It depends on the system. Sometimes you can actually list the specific chart of account number, and sometimes you just have to list kind of a description that matches your chart of accounts. But that makes reconciling those two systems easier. that make sense? Does that answer that question? Okay. Anybody else? I think we're right at our time, but
Gosh, good information.
alrighty. Well, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Cassie.
Helpful
Hope
stuff.
this was helpful.
Thank you very
Good.
much.
Good. And if anybody would like a business card, I've got a few up here.
Good.